Good afternoon and welcome to the Atlantic Council. I'm Jonathan Panikoff, the director of the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative, part of our Middle East programs. We are now 9 days after Hamas's horrific terrorist attack that left over 1,400 Israelis and foreign nationals dead, thousands more injured, and 150 kidnapped and brought back to Gaza as hostages. In Israel today, preparations for a ground invasion continue, with Israel having caught up 360,000 reservists. As Israel prepares for a ground war, airstrikes from Israel continue to hit Gaza, with estimates of those killed in the Strip ranging between just over 2,100 to 2,600. Israel has told 1.1 million or so Gazans living in the northern part of the territory to evacuate and head south, warning them ahead of what appears to be an almost certain ground incursion. Hamas, conversely, has told those residents not to leave their homes. All of this is happening against a backdrop of massive misinformation on social media sites, most prominently on Telegram as well as X, formerly known as Twitter. And as the conflict continues, critical questions on regional countries' security and the role varying alliances will play in the region will only grow. To help us dive deep into issues of the coming ground war, the information space, and the regional environment, it is my pleasure to introduce our three experts joining us for today's panel. Jean-Louis Simon is a senior research fellow at the National University of Singapore's Middle East Institute and a non-resident senior fellow with us here at the Atlantic Council. Before joining MEI, he was a professor at the UAE National Defense College and the NATO Defense College, and before that was a policy analyst with the Directorate for Strategic Affairs of the French Ministry of Defense. An expert in Middle East security affairs, most prominently Gulf militaries and Israel's military strategy, Jean-Louis has authored 5 books on these issues. Dina Sadek joins us via Zoom. Dina is a Middle East research fellow at the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab. Prior to joining DFR Lab, Dina worked at Internews and at the International Republican Institute, including as a global media development and countering disinformation specialist. She also managed regional civil society capacity building programs in the Middle East and North Africa region, and previously was a Cairo-based freelance reporter, field interpreter, and fixer for several international media outlets in Egypt and Libya. Our final panelist, Alex Plitzas, also joins us via Zoom. Alex is a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Middle East programs and the former chief of sensitive activities for special operations and combating terrorism in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He worked as a strategic planner for the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, during which he was deployed to Afghanistan, in addition to having deployed twice to Iraq, once in uniform, leading a psychological operations team during the surge, including himself fighting in the Battle of Sadr City, and a second time as a civilian. Jean-Louis, Dina, welcome to all of you. Jean-Louis, let me begin with you if I can. We're going to spend a lot of time today talking about the ground war, the information war, the multilateral environment. But few people have done as much research and have as much expertise as you do in Israel's missile defense, and that includes Iron Dome. And so let's start with what we know when it comes to Hamas rockets being fired at Israel, if we could. In the early morning of October 7th, in Israel, Hamas fired about 2,200 rockets at central and southern Israel. Since then, rockets have continued to be fired every day. That includes yesterday when the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and Mitt Romney were leading a delegation that actually had to head to the bomb shelter in Tel Aviv. I think anyone who's watched the news the last 9 days or so has heard of Iron Dome. But for those unfamiliar with it, much beyond the name, what is it? How effective is it? And how has it been deployed by Israel thus far in the conflict?
Well, I mean, first of all, thank you very much, Jonathan, for the invitation. And let's start right away with the question of Iron Dome. Iron Dome is an air defense system that was created in 2007. The idea was to protect the population in the south of Israel from rockets that were launched from Gaza. In terms of the type of threats that Iron Dome can intercept, we're talking about rockets up to 70-kilometer range. So probably something like 45 miles, I would argue. The way the system works is like a lot of missile defense systems. You have radars that are monitoring and detecting incoming rockets, and you have interceptors. Those are basically missiles that are fired at the incoming rocket. The cost is quite expensive. Where we're talking about for the interceptor, for one interceptor, we're talking about something like $50,000, roughly speaking. And the cost of one battery of Iron Dome is about $100 million. In terms of the effectiveness, we don't know yet for this conflict. The IDF has not publicized any statistic on that. But so far it seems to be working the same way it worked in previous conflicts, which was about roughly 90% of interception rate, which is quite significant. And the reason why, until today, Iron Dome was seen as this success story of Israel's defense against the rockets from Hamas. Now, the problem is that, one, Iron Dome never succeeded in deterring attacks from Hamas. You mentioned the number of rockets in the first days of the conflict, and I think now we're about 6,000 rockets in 9 days. This is more than what Hamas fired, for instance, in the 50-day conflict in 2014. So what we see, unfortunately, is a trend towards bigger and more sophisticated rockets from Hamas. That's a big question in the coming days, because the problem is that we're talking about a dozen of batteries that Israel deploys on its territory. The question becomes, is it possible to overwhelm those Iron Dome batteries, especially if you have a new front with Hezbollah? And one of the reasons probably why we want to avoid that, the opening of that new front, is also that this would overwhelm Israel's missile defense. Now, this scenario has been discussed for many years, and one of the reasons, for instance, the US provides exceptional funding to Iron Dome since the 2016 agreement between US and Israel is to address that potential scenario where Israel would be faced with that overwhelming threat from rockets, not just from Gaza, but potentially from Hezbollah. So in a nutshell, this is how Iron Dome works, and so far has been working during this conflict.
Let me follow up for just 1 second, and I'm sure we're going to talk about Hezbollah later in this program. But Israel does have other missile defense systems. Can you talk a little bit about, let's say, if Hezbollah gets involved, where some of the other systems might come into play, especially when we're talking about a Hezbollah capability that has ballistic missiles as well?
Right. So the Iron Dome system is designed to intercept rockets. So basically, systems that have a very poor accuracy. Hezbollah has about 100,000 or more, 150,000, depending on the numbers of those systems. But in addition to that, they also have ballistic missiles. In this case, Iron Dome would not be relevant. So that would be the David Sling system, which Israel operates for low, mid-range ballistic missiles. The system has not been under pressure until recently because there has not been major war with Hezbollah since 2006. So it's something also to consider that if we have Hezbollah getting into the fight, that's not just a matter of quantity of the arsenal, it's a matter of quality. Hezbollah is much bigger, stronger than Hamas. Its arsenal is older. So it is a game changer also because that would put pressure on the other systems for Israel.
Alex, let me turn to you if I could. Almost certainly a ground invasion seems to be coming. And I want to quote something you wrote recently for us here at the Atlantic Council. You said, quote, "The only way for Israel to achieve its goal of eliminating Hamas's military capabilities is house to house, block to block, urban warfare. It will likely involve both conventional and special operations forces moving methodically through the area to eliminate the terrorist threat and destroy any and all military capabilities from communications gear to weapon stocks. Alex, the Gaza Strip, for those who aren't aware, is quite small. It's about twice the size of Washington, D.C., just slightly bigger than that. What you're describing sounds incredibly intensive, an incredibly slow process. For those who are unfamiliar with urban warfare, talk a little bit about what you think it would actually look like on the ground for the IDF and how long you estimate such an effort would take.
Sure. I mean, it's an excellent question. I mean, when we look at what's going on now, well, the Israelis are in the middle of what we would call kinetic shaping operations. So they're really designed to do two things. Very similar to the battle that we in the United States fought in Baghdad in 2008 when Iranian-backed militias were firing rockets into the green zone. There were a number of strikes that took place to try to take out the rocket teams to prevent the civilian populace. And then the secondary objective there would be to take out as much of the infrastructure as possible prior to a ground assault commencing to try to protect the troops that are on the ground. Now, all of this is predicated upon the publicly stated goal from Prime Minister Netanyahu, which was the destruction of Hamas's military capabilities, which I believe to be an appropriate and achievable objective. And I'll say that because there have been other calls to, quote, completely eradicate Hamas. Hamas is a group, but it is a group as much as it is an ideology. And as we've learned from 20 years of counterterrorism operations, you can't defeat an ideology with bombs and bullets. But what you can do is you can take strategic military capabilities away from it and prevent the organization from being able to conduct the spectacular type of terrorist attack that we saw a week ago this past Saturday, where 1,400 innocent Israelis were murdered. The single largest number of Jews killed in a single day, in part due to the fact that they were Jewish since the Holocaust. So from a political perspective, it puts a lot of pressure on Prime Minister Netanyahu to achieve the objective I just mentioned. So to do that, you're going to try to soften as much as you can from the air. Then you have an obligation under law of armed conflict to make sure you clear civilians off the battlefield, which is why you're seeing the dissemination of text messages, WhatsApp messages. You're seeing leaflets being dropped, public statements on television. You're seeing it on social media. And then in certain cases earlier on, they were doing, what they would call roof knocking, where the Israelis would drop inert munitions on a building if it was mixed use, as a warning to the civilians to clear out. You try to do that as much as possible. They've given several days already, and they're likely going to invade probably the next couple of days, just given conditions on the ground and letting people out to get civilians to clear. But at that point, the only way you can actually achieve that objective of destroying the military capabilities is you actually have to do so. And because those capabilities are housed within infrastructure inside of Gaza, whether that be in tunnels or homes or trapdoors or whatever else, you literally have to search every structure. You have two choices. You can either level the place altogether, which doesn't make sense for a whole host of reasons, or you can go in and actually, conduct a cordon and search and methodically go through the area. Hamas is an Iranian-backed militant group that operates in Gaza, right? But this is not Iran's first rodeo, so to speak. They had a number of Shia militias that they backed in Baghdad who engaged in urban warfare against U.S. troops. They've had 20 years to study Western military tactics, and for a militarily superior force that has armor and aviation that a terrorist group does not, and be able to try to lure them into house-to-house combat to try to mitigate the advantage that the Israelis would have through armor and things of that nature. They've also engaged in the past in booby-trapping houses, bombs here or there, trapdoors, everything else. So depending on the number of Hamas fighters who decide to remain inside of Gaza City, and depending on the defenses they put up, and then how many civilians remain on the battlefield who are unable to clear, will really speak to the timing. And as you mentioned, given the size of Gaza and the tasks that they've been given, this is not something that you can achieve quickly and nothing more than a matter of a couple of months, so to speak. So it's not something that's going to be days by any means. If the objective that was stated is exactly what Israel is seeking to achieve.
Alex, let me ask, because as you talk about needing to go house to house, you mentioned the Israelis have given warnings, dropped leaflets, WhatsApp messages. There's reporting today that about 500,000 Gazans have left their homes and moved southwards in the Strip. But for those who haven't left their homes and have made the decision they're not going to leave, What are the biggest risks to Palestinian civilians as the IDF goes forward? And what are the biggest risks to the IDF? You talked about booby traps. Is there a likelihood that we're going to see IEDs and booby traps that will undermine the IDF's efforts?
Well, the element of surprise is gone, right? The IDF has made it quite clear they're planning to invade, so they've lost the element of surprise. I would imagine the invasion will take place at night to take advantage of night vision capabilities that the Palestinian, terrorist groups don't have. But short of that, at the end of the day, it's still, combat that we're talking about. And one of the worst situations you can encounter as a soldier, whether that be conventional or special operations forces, is a barricaded shooter. So inside of a building where you've got a shooter and a doorway, which we would refer to as the fatal funnel, because there's largely, especially due to construction in the area, you can't really use a significant amount of explosives without collapsing the building. You end up going through that door, and if there's people inside, that's where weapons are pointed at. So, surprise is gone. You've got a limited number of entry points. You're in a densely populated urban environment. It's not, this misnomer, it's not the most densely populated. It's not even top 25 worldwide, but it is very densely populated. Baghdad is more. But it does mitigate the use of armor to a certain extent. And if there's civilians on the battlefield, it'll also limit, what weapon systems may be available to the Israelis to use, or the rules of engagement for being able to use them. So, for example, in 2008, the Shia militias were firing mortars at our compounds that we'd occupied inside of Baghdad and Sadr City to try to keep them from firing rockets at the civilian area. We were denied permission to be able to do counter mortar fire because of the risk of killing civilians on the battlefield, because even though we had given warning, there were still too many around to use an indiscriminate weapon like that. So the conditions in the coming days, as the Israelis get there and get their eyes on the battlefield and see exactly what's left, I think will also speak to any changes to the rules of engagement and what weapon systems can be used. But at the end of the day, you still can't shoot an unarmed civilian, and that's not something the Israelis would want to engage in anyway. But that's the reality when you're facing a terrorist group that is a non-uniformed army that blends in with the civilian populace, which makes it more difficult, and one that is known to use civilians as shields. I am currently in touch with a number of Western NGO workers who are on the ground in Gaza right now, and a number of them have reported that Hamas is firing rockets from locations near some of these NGO areas. So it's not, it's not something that we haven't seen before, and therefore it presents a very difficult challenge, for the Israelis. For the Palestinian people who are there, giving a couple of days for people to move south, they have the ability to walk and open a corridor. There have been reports of vehicles being struck headed southbound, potentially Hamas stopping people from leaving. At the end of the day, they've been given a lawful order to evacuate the area by the Israeli military. It depends on what happens afterwards. The Israeli government also cut off utilities, electric, water, etc., into Gaza for a number of days, and then recently reestablished it in southern Gaza only. And there was supposed to be an opening of the Rafah crossing this morning to allow humanitarian aid in and or foreign citizens out of Gaza and into Egypt. And both Hamas and the Israeli prime minister came out right before it was supposed to open and said there was no such agreement. So no one knows exactly what happened in the background. And the reason I mention that is it's likely that there will be a humanitarian aid distribution point, water, food, medicine, et cetera, in southern Gaza, which will then also serve two objectives, right? To be able to take care of the Palestinian people, but then also if folks in the north need food, water, and medicine, and a humanitarian corridor is opened, they would be able to move south to get what it is that they need, and therefore remove them from the battlefield, which is what the Israelis are seeking. So there's still a lot of work to be done to remove civilians off the battlefield. Hamas, if they are deciding to entrench themselves and be well prepared with explosives and weapon systems inside of buildings that they're going to lure the Israelis into, knowing they're coming to do searches to find weapons, they can put up a formidable fight, and they will have a very lethal challenge to the Israeli army, who will be able to militarily achieve the objectives in the long run. But depending on how much of a fight Hamas is willing to or wants to put up, it could be a very bloody and costly battle.
Dina, thank you for joining us. Let me turn to you. Before we get to where the information landscape is going and how it will complicate the very operations Alex just spoke about, let's talk about what's already happened and what's happening over the last 9 days. Along with a colleague of yours, Leila Mashkor, you just published last Thursday a review of initial findings of information landscape of the war. And let me also quote a part of what you wrote as well for our audience. You said The Telegram channel for Hamas's military wing, the Israel-Hamas Brigades, has experienced significant growth since the start of the conflict. During the one-year period prior to the attack on October 7th, the brigade's channel grew from approximately 182,000 to 205,000 subscribers, with each post averaging 25,000 views. On October 7th, the day the conflict started, the channel gained more than 135,000 new subscribers. At the time of writing on October 12th, which was last Thursday, the channel had tripled in size from pre-war levels, surpassing 619,000 subscribers, while its posts averaged more than 239,000 views per post, nearly a tenfold increase. Dina, let's start with the basics for those who are unfamiliar with Telegram. What is it, and then what does such explosive growth in such a short period tell you about Hamas's reach not only in the Gaza Strip, but more broadly?
Yeah, happy to. First of all, thank you, Jonathan, and to the entire team for organizing this event and allow us to contribute our perspectives. Telegram is a messaging application founded about a year ago. It's similar to other messaging applications like WhatsApp and Signal that have become more commonly used nowadays. One can create a Telegram channels that individuals can subscribe to, and they act as sort of groups or pages on social media platforms that you can have your own sets of followers on them called subscribers in Instagram, and that way you can post to them a lot of real-time updates. In terms of your question about its explosive growth, I don't think it tells us much about Hamas's reach. I think it tells us more that they're keeping up with the times, with the tools that they can use to best broadcast their updates and propaganda. Keep in mind that Hamas and their military wing, Al-Qassam Brigades, they both had Telegram channels for a few years right now, but they have increased their subscribers only as a result of this particular conflict escalation. Telegram is not just used by Hamas. Telegram is becoming more widely used in conflict scenarios. We have seen it being used in more recently, especially since last year, with the war in Ukraine, where a lot of major updates were being posted on such channels. And it was also instrumental in following news with attempted coup in Russia. But in this particular conflict, with not really robust moderation policies on Telegram to ensure the platform does not get misused by malicious groups or those who post propaganda and disinformation content, it has been used for that. And its use has skyrocketed by different stakeholders in this conflict, predominantly by Hamas and supporters. But I will also point out that the IDF has a Telegram channel as well, posting it less than other places, but it is widely used by a lot of parties in this conflict.
You said you talked about the new subscribers. Is there a way to differentiate and tell who those new subscribers are? In other words, is it secretive just to Hamas on their channels, or can we as the public, or you as a researcher and expert in this field, actually figure out who the subscribers are? The other thing I wanted to raise is that you mentioned Israel. How does this compare to the Israeli government's presence on social media, whether Telegram or X or other platforms?
I can't really see those lists of subscribers for those channels, but I would also point out that those are large numbers of subscribers. Some of these groups have 10,000 subscribers, but some of them have 500,000 subscribers. So we're talking about a lot of people if we're trying to find out who these subscribers are. In terms of Israeli use of social media, we are seeing the Israeli government and its official more present on other platforms, such as Facebook and Twitter. I did mention they have also the IDF has a Telegram channel that it posts its updates on, but we've seen the Israeli Air Force, Foreign Ministry, the Prime Minister's account, and a few other official Israeli accounts are more active on X and Facebook. That being said, this also makes sense because Hamas is designated as a terrorist group by a lot of countries, and a lot of social media platforms have their policies designating them as such. So it does make sense that they would go to a group like Telegram that does not have such moderation policies, and for the Israeli government and its official to be going to the other platforms.
Alex, let me actually turn back to you. Dina just highlighted Hamas leveraging Telegram to broadcast a lot of its propaganda, its messaging. Obviously, some of that messaging, and we'll see if this increases, of late is going to be about the hostages. I think I said in my introduction that the hostage numbers were 150. That was actually a mistake. I think the new numbers as of this morning were up to 199, and there's concerns that those numbers actually may be low. Talk for a second about how the hostages complicate the ground invasion. What are your expectations for how Hamas will leverage the hostages, use the hostages? 200 is a lot. Obviously, back in 2006, there was one hostage in Gilad Shalit held by Hamas, and it took over 5 years for him to be released. And he was a military personnel. Most of these hostages are civilians. Can you talk a little bit about what the hostages are going to mean for the ground operations, but more generally for the coming conflict?
Sure. I mean, hostage rescue is part of my portfolio at the Pentagon. I was on the 2015 hostage policy review team where we created the special envoy for hostage affairs as well as the hostage recovery fusion cell. And unfortunately, I've had to at least have policy oversight and operations oversight for a number of our hostage cases over the years. And what I can tell you is this is by far one of the most complex hostage situations that I've ever read about, let alone seen in my professional career. You had, well, first of all, we just take it from the beginning, right? This was not a random act. There were over 2,500 Hamas terrorists that infiltrated into Israel, and there were hostages taken from many different areas where they were operating inside of Israel, where they were executing civilians. So it wasn't one group or one cell who randomly decided, hey, we should grab some hostages and head back to Gaza because the Israeli forces are coming after us. It was clearly a premeditated plan to take hostages from across Israel to bring them back into Gaza. So that's significant for a couple of reasons, right? It largely says that Hamas knew that they were going to be successful in the operation. How successful? I don't think anybody knows if they actually thought they were going to be as successful as they were, given what they set out to do. But they realized that there was going to be an Israeli, response that was going to be significant to what it was that they were doing, and therefore they were going to take hostages, usually for two reasons, right? Either as a human shield or as bargaining chips in the background, or both. So with two, almost 200 hostages, what we're looking at, there's a couple things. One, they're likely dispersed. They're not going to have them all in one spot. You'd have to have intelligence to try to find where all of them are. And then the threat to a helicopter from, a shoulder-fired missile, which has a maximum ceiling of about 10,000 feet. That's a shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missile. Whether then an RPG, a couple hundred feet or so, or a small arms fire reaching into the 2,000 feet or so, makes a helicopter-borne operation into Gaza extremely difficult, let alone simultaneous clandestine hostage rescues for over 200 people. It makes it virtually impossible in order to do that. And then there's also no ability to get a quick reaction force or a medevac unit in there to take out any wounded. So the risk to Israeli forces and the civilians would be extremely high. So if you're a military planner looking at the situation in Gaza, it leaves you with like a limited number of options. Either a ground incursion coming across, again, very densely populated area, and the element of surprise is gone, and then potentially any infiltrations by sea to land on the beaches there. But in either case, it's most likely going to be a conventional and combined special operations force ground incursion into Gaza, and hostage rescue will be part of what it is that they're doing while they're there. Now, the responsibility for the safe care of those hostages is on Hamas. It is not on Israel. Israel has given legal and justifiable warning for people to evacuate areas where they intend to conduct lawful military activities in response to what has taken place, which is the destruction of military capabilities that were used to attack and kill civilians. Right. So if Hamas decides that they want to keep those hostages there against their will and they are killed during combat operations, Israel will do what they can, I think, to avoid the civilian casualties, and particularly the hostages. They're not looking to kill any more, Israeli nationals, let alone foreign citizens either. But there is a chance that, yes, that mistakes can be made, but it is Hamas's responsibility to ensure that they are not killed and removed from the areas where combat is going to take place. Otherwise, it's simply just another war crime to add to the litany of things that Hamas has done over the last week and a half as an organization. So it makes it difficult, and you'll see, I think, potentially some special operations, raids either ahead of or in line with conventional force movements into the area. But that's speculative based on battlefield conditions, and not that I have any intelligence. And if I did, I certainly wouldn't be discussing, for operational security purposes anyway. So that's just that's my assessment based on what's going on the ground.
Alex, Hamas has already said that if airstrikes continue, it will kill hostages. It's unclear whether that has actually already happened or not. How do you expect you talked about Hamas dispersing the hostages to various locations. Do you expect the hostages to be co-located with, say, leadership to try and make it less likely for the Israelis to strike? Do you expect them to be put into tunnels so the Israelis will think twice about collapsing tunnels? How will Hamas actually leverage the hostages physically as well?
That's an excellent question. So there's a couple of schools of thought on that, and it really ties back to what Hamas's objectives are with the hostages. If they are seeking to utilize them as strategic bargaining chips to try to get themselves out of some jeopardy, or to be able to get some things that they want if they believe that they can get them through negotiations, then they're going to want to keep those hostages safe, because a dead hostage doesn't do them any good. If they are, in a position where they feel that they are safer with hostages near them and that the Israelis won't strike if they're there, then yes, they'll likely try to keep them close to key areas or command centers, or with leadership, right? But does that bring about additional chatter? Additional people who are aware of where the hostages are. That means additional individuals, additional cell phone calls, additional text messages. The operational security risk grows the more people that are in contact with the hostages. So, I mean, there certainly will be in areas that are under Hamas control. So they won't be in some random civilian's home. They'll be wherever Hamas is, that they can control those individuals. There were some reports that, multiple groups were holding the hostages. It may not just be Hamas itself, but other, factions of Palestinian terrorist groups that operate within Gaza may be holding some as well. And so that's really the difficulty of the situation is the sheer number of hostages held by different organizations and dispersed, all over the battlefield. There's been reports that some were killed. I think Hamas made statements of that nature. I also saw some reports yesterday where Hamas had said 9 had been executed. So the status of the hostages really remains unclear, because we really haven't seen them, either alive or dead in either case. No one really has a good understanding of the disposition of them or where they're located, and that's part of the problem at the moment.
Jean-Luc, let me turn back to you. When we talk about hostages, in fact, there's actually been discussion about whether Qatar might try to negotiate, that they are negotiating for the release of at least some of the civilian hostages. The international community's reaction to this as a whole has been fairly mixed, and the regional reaction has been quite mixed. You saw from the UAE said it was appalled, and Bahrain explicitly denounced the hostage-taking specifically. On the other hand, we saw Qatar singularly blame Israel for the entirety of the attack. In fact, and that blame has continued in one of the state daily papers just recently. In Qatar, there was a poem glorifying Hamas and the attack by an editorial columnist. The U.S. has pushed for the Rafah border, the border between Gaza and Egypt, to be open for humanitarian aid, and as well to let U.S. nationals, dual nationals, leave through that crossing. Palestinians looking for safety to escape the violence maybe has been pushed to be able to go through that crossing. Cairo has largely refused to do that so far. We heard from Alex earlier that it hasn't opened. Help us make sense of the region's reaction as a whole, because it's quite a mixed bag. And especially knowing popular opinion on the Arab street, is this about protecting their own domestic security? Is this about long-held views? Is this about a view in terms of how Israel acted, normalization? What is going on here across the region?
Thank you, Jonathan. It's an important question because a lot of those countries are US partners, so we need to better understand what's going on with these reactions. And I would argue that the mixed reactions have different motivations. The first one, the most obvious one, is the state of the public opinion. If you look at Al Jazeera or any of the Arab medias, clearly the emphasis is on the humanitarian tragedy or the speculations on the next humanitarian crisis that we'll see in Gaza as a result of the Israeli operation. So the population as a whole has a tendency to dismiss, if not downplay, the importance of the initial attack from Hamas because of the outrage in the public opinion, but which relates to, let's say, a continuity with previous conflicts or previous crises, especially in the last years, that have been brewing in the public opinion in the Arab world. The second aspect, which I think is also very important for some of those countries, they have the memory of the 2006 war, when at the time Hezbollah launched an unprovoked attack that led to the conflict on Lebanon. At the time, several of those Arab countries condemned Hezbollah and actually supported the Israeli operation against Hezbollah. That was the first response at the time. Eventually, when the situation in Lebanon escalated and when we saw a humanitarian crisis, those Arab governments decided to denounce the Israeli operation. So I believe they also have memory of that conflict and how that put them at the time in a very delicate situation vis-a-vis their public opinion. Finally, another reason why those countries are careful not to be seen as complicit or supportive of Israel is the Iranian factor. The problem here is that Iran openly supported Hamas for years and has been praising the operation. So it puts countries, and in particular Saudi Arabia, in a very delicate situation because what the Saudi government wants to prevent is to be outflanked by Iran on the Palestinian cause. So that forces them also to be seen as the countries, the governments expressing their solidarity with the Palestinians, especially in the context of the ongoing intervention inside Gaza. So the Iranian factor, at least on the short term, forces them, at least in the way they understand the conflicts, they force them to express their support for the Palestinian cause because they want to prevent Iran to be seen as the sole supporter in the Arab and Muslim world of the Palestinian cause.
What does it mean long term if this conflict goes? Alex is talking about saying it's not going to be days, it's going to be probably months, frankly, if a ground operation goes the way that the Israelis have talked about to achieve their objectives. What does that mean for the Arab governments? Not just public opinion on the street, I presume, is only going to get worse, not better, the longer Israel's ground invasion goes. What does it mean for the governments?
Well, one of the reasons why those governments have been very cautious on the topic is that they understand that this is not like 2021 or any of the previous conflicts between Israel and Hamas since 2008, that the Israeli government has been very clear that it wants to get rid of Hamas, that this is a major war that is going to take a long time. And that means that no matter how careful, how cautious, how restrained the IDF might be, if they are, this will lead to casualties. And Arab governments, as a result, do not want to be seen as complicit. So that also is part of the uncertainty on the long term, that how we see the escalation in Gaza, how that escalation unfolds will probably lead to revision of the positions of those Arab states. In particular, what will be important to monitor is how this affects the countries that signed the Abraham Accords. So far, as you said, UAE and Bahrain have been very clear that in denouncing the operation of Hamas, to say that the responsibility was on Hamas. But the more we see humanitarian crisis inside Gaza, the more it will be difficult for those countries to be seen by the Arab populations, by the Arab public opinion, as those partners of Israel. So on the long term, that's also the key, how this conflict will jeopardize or not let's say, the momentum for normalization that we saw over the last 3 years.
As we continue this conversation, let me just remind those of you watching at home that you too can get involved. We'll have a question and answer period in just a little bit, and you can ask your questions by going to askac.org, submit them, and we'll be sure to get them in. Let me turn, Dina, back to you for just a second, if I could. Jean-Loup highlighted what, frankly, could be a rocky time for Israel and with a lot of the regional countries, depending how long this goes. But the entire region in the world is making a lot of decisions and developing views and policies based in part on what they're reading and seeing on social media nowadays. The problem being we've already seen huge amounts of disinformation and misinformation, false and unverified information, old footage being used, graphic materials have flooded social media platforms. In some cases, some of this disinformation has been unintentionally, but nevertheless, very impactfully emphasized by real journalists and by real media outlets, not just in the region, but in the West as well. Knowing that it's early days of the conflict, can you give our audience some examples of what you and your colleagues view as really the most dangerous, coordinated, intentional disinformation you've already seen, or even accidental, that's really having an impact on this conflict, so that folks watching really have an idea of just how difficult of a social media environment it is that we're operating in right now?
Last week or so, we have witnessed an overwhelming amount of content circulating on social media platforms and messaging applications. That content include old footage from this conflict and conflicts like Syria, and unverified information, graphic content. The main danger really here of all of these different types of content is that it has the potential of fueling hate speech and inciting or triggering further violence. What we have witnessed from the very first few days of this escalation is that there's a lot of speculation about what may or may have not happened and what might happen in the coming days. That is fueling a lot of the online conversation. Also, the amount of graphic violence that includes various forms of extreme violence that's circulating online. A lot of it is still being verified by media and fact-checking and verification groups. So a lot of that content is also fueling a lot of hate speech among people online and on messaging applications. There's also the footage that started circulating from other events like paragliders from other events, and that was due to Hamas's use of paragliders in this attack. Now, some of these footage may seem more innocuous than others, but they have the potential of fueling the conversation in really a bad way. We're also seeing a lot of content that contains Islamophobia and collective punishment against Palestinians, and other content that includes anti-Semitism and calling for further bloodshed by Hamas. There's massive amounts of content there, and takes some time to verify, but due to the sheer volume of the content that's available out there, it's hard to keep up the verification efforts. It's hard to keep up with the amount of content that is available out there.
Dina, do you have enough data already to estimate whether or not the majority of disinformation is coordinated? In other words, is it either a state-run entity that's pushing the disinformation for its own political purposes, or even individuals, but in a coordinated way, knowingly pushing the disinformation? Or is it really just a question of speculation by frankly overeager, news-hungry observers who see something and just retweet it, maybe without thinking this could be disinformation?
All of the above. So all of those patterns are currently developing as we speak. Some of them have already developed. And I believe we and others are working on exposing inauthentic coordination online that has been observed. But I think a lot of it is people rushing to understand and get news and report on what's going on. And as that is happening, that's where the false information is coming from, the speculations, and what's going to happen next. That's fueling a lot of emotions during a time of high tension. But I don't have specific findings right now to share on the inauthentic coordination that we're seeing, and we'll be publishing on that soon. But it's important to be reminded that it's been just a few days with overwhelming amount of information, and that's why those patterns are still developing of whether there is mass amounts of inauthentic coordination or not.
Let me ask all of you to wade a little bit more into the future with this next set of questions, if I could. Alex, let me start with you and ask you specifically about kind of what may come next in Gaza, recognizing we haven't even started the ground operation. But in 2005, Israel fully withdrew from the Gaza Strip. Then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon viewed Israel being there as both unsustainable from a security and demographic perspective. Here we are in 2023 now. Prime Minister Netanyahu said just a few days ago, we will destroy Hamas. Daniel Hagari, an IDF spokesman, said, we are crushing Hamas's ability to function as sovereign. We cannot continue to live with this rule, meaning Hamas's rule over Gaza. Alex, if Israel wants to prevent Hamas from governing, in other words, not just destroy its military capabilities or terrorist capabilities. You spoke eloquently earlier about the challenges with destroying it, given it's an ideology. But if it wants to prevent it from governing, does that mean that Israel is realistically going to have to reoccupy Gaza as well?
I had the same question myself, and Jake Tapper pressed the Ambassador Herzog, the ambassador to the United States, yesterday, and then we saw a subsequent statement from the Israeli ambassador to the UN about what the outcome of the operation will look like afterwards, because it does peg the question, right? So, since the inter-Palestinian war between Hamas and Fatah, which left the PLO in charge of the West Bank and and Hamas in charge of Gaza, you really have seen two sort of distinct political groups, right? And so if Israel's going to go in, let's talk about what the potential options are afterwards. If their goal is to completely destroy the military capability, yes, you'll leave some sort of residual government capability from Hamas. Is Israel going to accept a Hamas government afterwards, right? Especially with its leadership, that we've seen in videos from Doha, openly cheering and supporting what transpired. I doubt that very much. I also think they're probably dead men walking, and they're not going to be around too much longer wherever they are, just given the history of how these military operations work, that they ordered them, and they're not going to be safe for very long. So with that being said, what's the other option? Does Fatah come in? President Mahmoud Abbas from the PLO, does he then take control of the area in Gaza? He's made statements in the past that he will not enter Gaza, quote, on the backs of an Israeli tank. And that he will also not be seen, quote, as doing Israel's dirty work, in his opinion, where he'll come in and sort of clean up the mess that he believes is going to be created as a result of that. So if Fatah will not come in and take over administration, if Hamas is not a viable political option afterwards, and then yesterday from the statements from both of the ambassadors, that was, we do not want to occupy or reoccupy Gaza, was the exact terminology that was used. And we also do not want to rule over the 2.1 million Palestinians who live in Gaza. So it became quite clear that at least according to the ambassador statements, and it was, not one, but two separately, assuming that in doing so, they're speaking on behalf of the Israeli government, even though they are, ambassadors to a specific country. There isn't going to be a military occupation, as the ambassador called it, after the operation is over with. So you're going to see a lot of destroyed infrastructure that Hamas has used for a long time to conduct military operations. So there's going to need to be massive rebuilding inside of Gaza. Through the answering that question, it's clear that there is no desire for permanent displacement of the Palestinian people, which again was a significant concern for neighbors like Egypt, considering opening the Rafah crossing, because for them, if they did so and all the Palestinians, came out and went southbound to avoid the conflict, and then they closed the gates and Israel said you can't come back, they would effectively be, complicit in the end of the Palestinian territory of Gaza, which they will not want to do. So again, it seems like Israel does not want to do that either, based on the statements that have been made. So what are the other options then? If you don't have Fatah, you don't have Hamas, the Israelis don't want to do it. Do you have an outside third-party administrator like another Arab state who's going to come in and potentially oversee reconstruction and governance? Begs the question, will the Palestinians accept that as an option? And then also, it's not out of the realm of possibility or far-fetched. I mean, let's not forget Jordan, administers religious sites in Jerusalem as sort of a neutral arbiter or third party. It's not something I think anybody's had to consider before, but the question is a valid one. There is no clear answer right now for what happens at the end of this and what Gaza looks like, both as a livable and habitable space, but then also who's going to administer it afterwards.
Jean-Loup, let me use Alex's excellent framing of this to follow up with you. Let's say we get to a situation in which Israel says, no, we really are not going back in. Abbas does not take over, and of course it's worth remembering that one of the reasons the PA isn't in Gaza is because in 2007 Hamas threw them out. Is there anybody actually in the Arab world who would be willing? Is Jordan, which is kind of afar, willing to do it? Would Egypt be willing to do it? And under what circumstances, even if they were supported, say, financially, if the finances didn't have to come from them and they came from Qatar or the Emirates or others, would there even be the political will by Cairo, by Amman, by other capitals to take that role of administering Gaza?
Well, in the current circumstances, the response is no. We don't have at the moment any country that expressed any interest in that type of mission. So that actually tells us a lot about the uncertainties regarding the end game, because the Israeli government is very careful to express that it has no intention to occupy Gaza. But what we see is a situation which is very similar to other operations of the past 2 decades with the phenomenon of mission creep, where you go to Gaza with a very specific military objective, which is to get rid of Hamas capabilities. But as a result, you have a vacuum, and this vacuum needs to be addressed, because if the Israelis get rid of Hamas and then leave, the security question will still be around. The security of the southern border of Israel will still be at risk. So the fear, my concern is that we end up with a de facto occupation of Gaza, not because the Israelis wanted that to happen, but because there's just no other country right now that would be interested in that type of mission. Not to talk about let's say the United Nations and the likelihood, the very low likelihood of having something like a proposal from the UN Security Council on that. There's clearly no appetite at the level of the Security Council for such an ambitious, very expensive mission. So for all of these reasons, we're left with a very uncertain end game.
Before this conflict began, which seems much longer than it actually has been, the focus in terms of Israel's place in the region was really on normalization agreements. We mentioned the Abraham Accords earlier. Obviously, a possible normalization agreement with Saudi Arabia was in the works. But there are also broader global efforts in terms of regional integration. There's long been discussion about the potential for integrated air, missile, naval defense in the Gulf. There was a question about whether you could have greater economic integration between Israel, Saudi Arabia, Gulf states, between Europe and India. At the G20 last week, there was the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor that was launched. That was only about a month ago, but feels like a year ago at this point. And you wrote, actually, an issue brief, a mini report, so to speak, for the Atlantic Council over the summer, and it's entitled The Multilateral Movement and Opportunity for U.S. Policy. And I strongly recommend that our viewers take a look at the piece. You can find it on the Atlantic Council's website. But one of the things you said was this, and let me just quote you here. A first indicator of the viability of multilateral agreements is the degree to which the strategic priorities of its members align. The closer those priorities are, the stronger the resolve of the countries will be to cooperate on security matters. Conversely, if the countries differ on the threats and challenges they face, they may consider the multilateral setting as a diplomatic activity without much consequence apart from promoting trade and tourism. First, for our audience that may not have read the report, talk to us a little bit about what multilateralism is in this context, and then when the conflict ends, what you expect the strategic priorities of Israel, Egypt, Jordan, the Gulf states to be. Because if the threats are still the same, and you talked about Iran earlier, and if the threat is still Iran, does that still mean that there's a chance for some of these groupings to form, for some of the multilateral movements to go forward, even if it's not immediate?
Well, I mean, first of all, the future of all these initiatives will heavily depend on the scenarios we discussed. But to come back a few months ago, we had several initiatives, such as the India-Middle East corridor, which was announced at the G20 summit. We had the I2U2 multilateral, so the India, Israel, United Arab Emirates, and United States forum that was about promoting better trade relations between those four countries. The logic of those initiatives that started about 3-4 years ago in the midst of the Abraham Accords was the idea that it's now possible to have new groupings, informal groupings that include Israel and Arab states. The assumption was that because of the momentum brought about by the Abraham Accords, we can build on this and have a stronger, more cooperative Middle East architecture. Now, a lot of those initiatives had one key assumption, explicitly or implicitly, which was that it's possible to build those ties no matter what happens on the Palestinian issue. That was the underlying assumption, that you can have this great project of a corridor going from India to the Gulf, to the port of Haifa in Israel, and then eventually to Europe, without considering the Israel-Palestine issue. That's, in a way, in retrospect, it's a mistake that we all made, that the Middle Eastern countries made, that India did, same as the US and Europe. Now, all of these initiatives will have to address that question, because, for instance, the I2U2 multilateral, which is mostly about trade, the argument was all along that it's possible to put away or to put aside the security aspects, the security matters in the Middle East, and to focus on trade. What we see now, it's impossible. That we've been denying the elephant in the room. That was part, in a way, of the strategy of containing the Hamas issue inside Gaza for 2 decades. And that's one of the reasons, for instance, among all of those countries, Jordan refused to attend the Negev Forum, which is another of those initiatives that was launched by the Israeli government 1 or 2 years ago. Jordan refused to attend and to participate to this forum because the Jordanian government considered that it was not addressing the Palestinian issue. Now, if we want to be optimists in this whole grim discussion, we could see actually those initiatives has an opportunity for the day after the conflict ends, or the day after the operation in Gaza ends. Because the only big difference between this conflict and the previous conflicts is that there were no framework like those multilaterals, and in particular the Negev Forum, in the previous rounds of the conflict between Israel and Hamas. So one thing that could be worth exploring is to use those frameworks to discuss and to address the issue that we discussed a few minutes ago about the governance of Gaza, and more broadly, the Israel-Palestine relations, because there's no way that we can hide those relations or this issue. So the Gulf states in particular, those countries such as the UAE and Bahrain, can play a very constructive role in putting the question on the agenda. And in particular, I would argue the Negev Forum, because that's so far the forum that was designed for that purpose, to discuss security issues in the region. So let's hope that we can put the issue of Gaza and more broadly Israel-Palestine conflict on the agenda of the Negev Forum.
It also calls into question a little bit, I think, the concept of outside in, that you could compel the Palestinians to eventually agree to a peace agreement by having agreements with all the other Arab states first. It was a concept that helped drive the Abraham Accords in the Trump administration, but maybe it's still possible, maybe not. It's clearly being tested now, though.
Yes, I mean, a lot of the assumptions behind the Abraham Accords, but more broadly, in a way, the assumption that is challenged here is the assumptions we had since 2007. After 2007, as you mentioned, the solution to the Hamas issue was the blockade of Gaza, and more broadly, let's say, a containment strategy. The idea that we can, in a way, promote better relations between Israel, Arab states, while accepting a certain level of tension in Gaza. The idea was that Gaza was not a systematic or structural issue, that it would not prevent better relations among the countries of the region. Right now, we see the limits of that assumption, and definitely in coming months, coming years, if we go back to the prospects of the Saudi-Israeli normalization agreement, I'm sure the terms of that agreement, if that come back on the table, the terms will be very different from the terms we discussed before the war.
We're about to open it up to questions in just a second. I've got one more question for Dina before we do so, but again, at askac.org if you have a question. Dina, let me just ask you this, because Jean-Loup has talked about where countries are going to be in the coming months. Alex, obviously, about the war itself. But the fog of war, and what seems to be clear from both Jean-Loup and Alex's comments, is that we don't quite know what the end result is going to be, how countries are going to react, or what Gaza's future is going to look like in terms of who will govern it. The fog of war is real, especially in an urban battle, block by block, lack of clarity about what comes next. In very practical terms, for our audience at home, for people around the world, how do you tell on Telegram, on X, on other social media sites, what's real and what's not? How do you decipher what is news and what is propaganda, what is simply something old? What should our audience be doing to stay informed, frankly, aside from obviously going to dfrlab.org and reading your reports? But in real time, what should people be looking for, either as hallmarks that something may be disinformation, and to get clarity on what they're reading?
The reality is that you can, Jonathan. It's very difficult. This is something I've been saying this week more than I've ever said in my entire life. Do not believe everything that you say on the internet. It's always been a rule and still remains a very good one. It is difficult to determine what's true or not in social media. Even those of us that do this for a living, we are still determining what is factual or not. And it's not just as simple as looking at a video for 5 minutes and being able to decide based on a few things. There is a lot of research that goes into verifying this content. So I would find it very difficult to believe if the average social media user is able to do this unless they have those skills as well. As much as we are rushing to report on what's happening, this content will keep coming. This misinformation and disinformation content. So for audiences out there, and even for ourselves, go to your trusted sources of information and news. There is a lot of good social media profiles to follow that may have up-to-date updates, but maybe some of those people are working on verification of that information. Media outlets have full teams, and researcher institutions like ourselves have full teams that are working on making sure that this content is verified. Do follow those trusted sources. At the end of the day, if you are following someone on social media or an entity in social media that you don't know much about or don't know where they're getting their information, you can't trust that information. So the answer is simple. There will always be a lot of information out there that's false and not true and speculative. So be selective about what you read, especially for such an important event like this one. Go to trusted sources of information that have been working tirelessly on fact checking and verification of the information available to you. Also, official sources. Take it from the horse's mouth, so to speak. So there's the Israeli government has been posting a lot of updates on their official channels that it would be very easy to determine what they're saying and what they're not saying by going to their official sources as well.
Dina, just one last quick follow-up, because you mentioned earlier that Telegram, doesn't have anybody monitoring it for its content internally at Telegram. There's been a lot of frustration here in the U.S. and in Europe, especially about X, the Twitter, formerly known as Twitter, and whether or not the content is being sufficiently monitored. Questions about whether Elon Musk has pushed off, frankly, a lot of the monitoring teams. Can you talk to our audience a little bit about where that stands today for X and what it may mean in terms of content for this conflict specifically?
Absolutely. So we know that EU regulators have sent letters not just to X; they have sent letters to TikTok and to Meta and to YouTube as well. So there's worry from regulators from various platforms, and those letters have slight variations in them in the language that are used and the specific concerns of each platform. But X is one of the platforms that we know that the less focus on content moderation and the gutting of trust and safety teams has led to the spread of misleading and sometimes dangerous content on it. We know a few of those platforms, including X and Meta, have started already removing content from their platforms that are not is not in line with their policy. Whether because it's graphic or because it includes violence acts. So those efforts are still underway, but it remains to be seen what type of content will continue to spread in these platforms. Also, on this, I want to note that it's not just content that's available in English, because that's what a lot of people are focused on. But when it comes to content moderation and verifying content as well, there's a lot of content in Hebrew and Arabic that a lot of us are looking through. So that makes the job even harder, and not having teams in place to do proper content moderation and to trust and safety teams that don't just have the technical skills, but also have the proper culture and language skills while they're sifting through that content. That's very important and unfortunately lacking at some platforms at the moment.
It's going to get tougher, it sounds like, is the answer. Well, let's turn to some questions now. Again, if you have one, at askac.org. Our first question is from Ron. Alex, let me address this to you. Ron says, I understand that most tunnel entrances are in the basement of homes. With all the debris in Gaza City, how will the IDF be able to search for and access tunnels without clearing all the debris?
It's actually an excellent question. And yes, there's been reports of weapon stocks under buildings and underground tunnels for quite some time, and in some cases under civilian infrastructure, which is a violation of international laws. But that's not to be, unexpected when dealing with a terrorist organization, because they don't abide by those rules. Yes, if there are suspicions that those buildings are going to contain weapon stocks, there's potential that they could use specialized equipment to look for those from the outside. Very similar to what's conducted during, post tragedy like an earthquake where you send in a rescue team. But in that case, that's very specialized work. It will be extremely difficult if the buildings are destroyed to get to those weapons. And I think in an area of this size, to expect that they're going to get 100% of the weapons is not going to happen, right? You're going to have small arms left over and everything else. I think what Israel's really after here is ensuring that they're going to get the overwhelming vast majority of any of the strategic weapons, rockets, missiles, those types of things, and other weapon systems or large quantities of explosives that could be really used to conduct terrorist attacks inside Israel. I mean, I think there's going to be, the day that we don't see AK-47 somewhere in the Middle East is probably towards the end of the world. I'll put it that way. So there's still going to happen there at the end of this operation as well. So I think that's realistically what we're looking at. It's not going to be a zero-sum game with weapons or 100% or nothing. It'll be as close as they can get to it. But yeah, the debris in the buildings is going to make it difficult. But that, once again, is why they just can't simply level an entire city. One, for humanitarian purposes, and two, if your goal is to get those weapon stocks, like you said, you're not going to be able to do that if the buildings are leveled. So I think if they knew there was underground storage areas, the Israelis have munitions that they can drop that are specifically designed for that type of an operation. And they've launched or used some of them in the past couple of days to do so. But then they have to weigh that against the possibility of civilian casualties. So again, as part of shaping operations, they're striking as many buildings as they can hit now that they believe either contain weapon systems, command and control, communications, etc., that won't cause civilian casualties. But I do think you're correct. There's a possibility that there will be, buildings that are collapsed and there could still be weapons in the basement.
Okay. Jean-Loup, let me turn to you. Mikhail says, I'd like to ask about the possible harmful impacts of the war for other countries in the region. How do you think Syria, Lebanon, Egypt will be impacted in the long term?
Well, I mean, again, it depends on the scenario that we're considering. The closest and most immediate concern is for Lebanon, I would argue. What we see and what we've seen in the last week is that it's not very clear if Hezbollah will eventually get into the conflict. What we saw clearly is that they have been firing rockets or enabling Palestinian organizations operating inside South Lebanon to fire those rockets. My personal assumption is that if we see a very high intensive operation in Gaza, and if we see Hamas on the brink of total collapse, I'm pretty sure Hezbollah will intervene. I don't see how Hezbollah would not, in one way or another, intervene, just for the simple fact that they want to be seen as supporters of the Palestinian cause. So there's an element of its own identity which would be at stake if Hezbollah just is seen as a bystander, letting Hamas getting completely destroyed inside the Gaza Strip. I don't think this would mean total involvement of Hezbollah. This might be of what we've seen so far, which is very low-level skirmishes at the border. But for sure, I don't see Hezbollah just standing by while there's this escalation inside Gaza. Now, with regards to the other countries, with regards to Syria, so far there has not been any strong indication that you would have a new front potentially on the Golan Heights. There has been this scenario for many years now that there could be a multi-front conflict between Israel and its neighbors that would involve the Iranian proxies in the Golan area. So far, even less than in Lebanon, we saw some action, but that doesn't seem to lead to a real new front. And having said that, we saw also the UAE expressing, or at least stating to the Assad regime that it wanted to make sure the Assad regime does not enable that type of escalation. I'm not sure if the Assad regime has any agency when it comes to the Iranian proxies, but that clearly tells us how let's say the regional actors want to prevent that conflict from getting into an escalation. Having said that, with regards to Egypt, I think one of the reasons also why Egypt is ambivalent with regards to the evacuation of civilians from Gaza is that Egypt wants to prevent or wants to contain that Gaza crisis. From the Egyptian side, you see that as a potential humanitarian crisis that gets into Egypt, and given the state of the Egyptian economy, they probably think that they have no ability on their own to manage that potential humanitarian crisis, and they probably do not have yet any guarantees that they would be supported in terms of relief, financial relief by the international community. So the Egyptian element here, I would argue, is different in the nature of the challenges. For Lebanon and Syria, this is clearly about the opening a new front. For Egypt, it's more about the humanitarian consequences that the evacuation of civilians and more broadly the conflict inside Gaza can bring about for the country.
You started with Hezbollah, and I think that is a bit of the million-dollar question still, because Hezbollah's involvement fundamentally could change the nature of the conflict, given what you talked about earlier in terms of what Hezbollah has in its inventory versus what Hamas does, for instance. There is a question specifically on this, and let me just ask. There's an anonymous question posed that says, does Israel currently have the military capability, but also the willingness to risk a multi-front war if friction with Hezbollah further escalates along the border? If so, can it justify an on-the-ground invasion into Lebanon for deterrence purposes? And I'll come back to you, Jean-Louis, to start, but I'll ask Alex to weigh in as well afterwards.
Well, I mean, there are several aspects to the questions. The first element to keep in mind is that on Saturday, 6th of October, the problem was the intelligence and military failure to anticipate that type of operation from Hamas. Clearly now, the element of surprise has been lost on both Hamas or Hezbollah side. So we saw mobilization of more than 300,000 reservists on the Israeli side. The scenario of a multi-front conflict involving the Gaza Strip, Lebanon, and potentially the West Bank or the Syrian border has been discussed by the IDF for many years. So we can assume that they have been running several exercises on that scenario, and that they have now, especially with the full mobilization, that they have the means to conduct that type of conflict. The problem is that that doesn't mean that this will get better. If we have a conflict like this, as you said, Hezbollah has a tremendous firepower. So what we would see is an increase of civilian casualties, destruction of civilian infrastructures inside Israel, no matter how effective the air defense systems we discussed are. So the type of conflict we're discussing is a complete new scenario. It's not just the war on Gaza, it's a regional conflict. So that's also one of the reasons, if not the biggest reasons, why everyone so far seems interested in preventing this uncontrolled escalation.
And gets back to even what you said earlier in terms of the reaction of states and their own security and concern. You have a regional conflict could go as far as do the Houthis decide to get involved and use that as an opportunity to take advantage of what's going on in Israel, not to strike Israel, but to strike in Saudi Arabia, to strike in the Emirates, places they think that have been aligned and push their goals. Alex, what happens in terms of the on-the-ground portion of this? Is there a potential for Israel to, knowing what Jean-Louis said about that there's not going to be an element of surprise, the potential for a decision by Israel to strike first on the ground and try to hit at Hezbollah?
There's a couple of things to take this up a level that we still have to have in consideration in this conversation, right? So we are in a strategic standoff with ballistic missiles at the moment, and I'll explain what I mean by that because you mentioned a couple of the elements there. The United States has one aircraft carrier and a carrier strike group parked off the coast in the Mediterranean, a second one on the way that departed a week early from Norfolk Naval Base that will be on station in the coming days, and side by side having two carriers there. The British have sent two warships. The U.S. has moved F-15s, F-35s, and F-22s into the region. There were B-1 bombers in the U.K. And there has been both public and private messaging that's been quite clear to both Hezbollah and Iran not to get involved and not to escalate the situation, right? And we've seen some messages from the Iranians to indicate that they, there's been mixed messaging. Yesterday, there was something attributed to an Iranian official at the UN to a reporter saying, look, if you don't attack Iran, kill our people, our interests, we have no interest in attacking Israel. But that is in stark contrast to a very hard red line position it seemed like that was established that said, hey, if the operation in Gaza escalates, we will be, quote, forced, to get involved. So what does all that mean in that context, right? So when the U.S. started moving warships in the area, you saw propaganda online where Hezbollah was revealing, images of anti-ship missiles, which is clearly aimed at the United States as a, hey, you're sending ships, we have the ability to strike. Iran very publicly messaged that their, capabilities could include, as you mentioned, from Yemen. I don't see the Houthis taking advantage. They're the Iranians and the Saudis are, getting along for the moment, even if it's a matter of convenience after that little, warming of relations that the Chinese brokered between the two. But to see missiles launched from Iran, from Yemen, and then from Lebanon, and then potentially from Syria. I mean, Assad's capabilities aren't really there. He's not in charge, as was just mentioned about, the militia groups. Iran really controls it. He's really just kind of, it's pathetic, but it's kind of a puppet. And, Aleppo and Damascus are really used as a weapons transit point. But for Iran, after the U.S. deposed, Saddam, and we had democratic elections and returned control to the majority, which was Shia, not Sunni, there's now friendly governments to Tehran in Baghdad and Damascus and all the way through southern Lebanon. So Iran controls, to a certain extent, foreign policy and security policy from Tehran all the way across to the Mediterranean on the north side of Israel. So there's also something that hasn't been discussed. Separate from this ongoing conflict and how it gets resolved, we still have an unresolved nuclear problem with Iran, and the reports coming out prior to this conflict kicking off, even from the folks who were the most optimistic and wanted to make sure there was an agreement to prevent conflict with the Iranians, have made it quite clear that the agreements that were on the table previously are simply not going to cut it, given how advanced their program is. So now Iran has some strategic decisions to make. Right? I think there were some very valid points that were just made by both my colleagues here previously, and that is that if Israel were to strike first, I absolutely believe that there would be, if it was an actual massive strike to try to take out, Hezbollah capabilities, I think there would be retaliation without a doubt. I think both sides have messaged they have no desire to go to war with each other for right now. Lebanon is also broke. The country literally cannot afford a war right now. It's not in the best position it was in. The 2006 war was not great for Israel, and the conflict that occurred on the ground there was costly. And then Iran has to weigh, Hamas is being decimated inside of Israel. And then now the other major arsenal you have in the area is 120 to 150,000, rockets and ballistic missiles that Hezbollah has in southern Lebanon. If they were to go ahead and execute that now and deplete that capability, Iran loses its two proxies in the area to be able to deal with counterstrikes in the event that something happens with their nuclear program. They're losing a little bit of deterrence. And let's also not forget, while it's gone unacknowledged since a picture surfaced in the 1980s of a plutonium reprocessing plant, that was labeled by Israel, I believe, as a saltwater desalination plant. Unfortunately, it was in the middle of the desert with no water. It's very clear that their weapons program that's not discussed is between 80 to 200 nuclear weapons. There's always discussions about returning to the 67 borders, in which case Israel would be 11 miles wide at its thinnest point, which is militarily indefensible. And any, existential threat to the existence of Israel as a Jewish state, could very well be met with a tactical nuclear weapon on the ground to prevent that from happening. None of the other states that we're talking about have that. So Israel still maintains strategic nuclear deterrence there. Iran still has to deal with its own nuclear problem. Lebanon is broke. And do they really want to exhaust their only remaining large proxy capability in the area over this right now? That being said, I think the Israeli, Achilles heel here in terms of the operation is not on the military side. They're overwhelmingly far, military superior, and they will achieve whatever objectives they want if they're willing to sustain the cost and the casualties over time. It's really going to be the humanitarian situation on the ground. Those images broadcast, and I mean, Dina just mentioned, the value of some of the propaganda and what's going on, and even in this case, not propaganda, but if there's news images, constantly and consistently being broadcast where, there's many, many Palestinian civilians being killed, the area is in complete disarray, water and food aren't provided. There's no medicine. I don't know how realistically it is for actors who are there in the region to sit on the sidelines and not take action. And since we know that this is going to be a several month-long operation, we just established that no one has a clear idea of what the end state looks like, because there is no clearly discernible political solution to who governs Gaza afterwards, which could lead to a further protracted military operation of some sorts. We're sitting on a powder keg. I don't think anyone has any idea how this is going to end in that regard, and it really depends on how the ground operation goes. It'll dictate whether others get involved, and either whether or not that's a trigger point. That could be a policy line that they're still waiting to see whether it happens. I do believe that the actors in the region firmly understand that this ground incursion is going to happen. So that was my other consideration, is when Iran came out publicly and said, hey, if this escalates and there's a ground incursion, we're going to get involved. They made that statement knowing full well that there's no way Israel was not going to be going in on the ground to destroy Hamas's military capabilities. If you were Prime Minister Netanyahu and you oversaw, the country at a time when the single largest terrorist attack took place, a spectacular intelligence failure, not only there, but also by all the Western services and regional actors, and it's the largest number of Jews, killed since the Holocaust, you have an obligation as the leader of that country to ensure that that doesn't happen again. There's no other way to do it but going in on the ground, and Iran knows that. So the last piece I'll leave you with there, I think, was the intelligence failure. There were 2,500 Hamas operatives that crossed into Israel. They were supported by rockets, which means you had rocket teams. They all had to have logistics support. There was a command and control element. All of that required rehearsals, training, surveillance. You're talking at least 3,000 people being involved directly or indirectly over a period of months, who all speak to other human beings. They've got phones. They're on social media. They text message. They make phone calls. The operational security that was practiced here is almost stunning when you think about it. And so that also speaks to Hamas's ability to operate as a sophisticated actor.
Quickly running out of time here today, I think worth remembering the 2006 war had unintended escalation. No side actually wanted a war, but the kidnapping of soldiers across the southern Lebanese border, northern Israeli border, brought that escalation, and Israel's response. Nasrallah has said, had he known that was going to happen, he never would have allowed it to happen. Also worth remembering for our audience, I think, is Iran's command and control is less than full over some of these proxy groups. More so over Hezbollah, but over the Houthis, very much not so. They've got their own not only views, but their own requirements about what it is that they need to accomplish and what's in their own self-interest. Real quickly, there is a really important question that I do want to get to. Dina, there's a question that says, what are possible solutions to rising domestic Islamophobic and anti-Semitic violence, threats, and hate speech that are coming from social media across the world? That may actually be the hardest question of the panel. But what are your thoughts? How do we combat this online in a much better way?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question to answer, and if I had that answer, I would definitely be richer beyond belief. I think right now, all what is needed is more content moderation, and for social media platforms to take a bit of responsibility for how their platforms are being used. Unfortunately, I don't have all the answers, but we want people to continue to be using social media to not just socialize, to continue to get news and updates. Right now, it falls on both the average individual to be more responsible about the information that they're consuming and sharing.
Oh, we may have lost Dina here just at the end. Okay, let me just quickly turn back to one question that's also here, just in a couple minutes here before we finish. Jean-Loup, you said that the quality of ballistic missiles from Hezbollah can threaten Israeli missile defense. Is there a critical mass of lower tier missiles that could drastically reduce the aforementioned 90% estimate of Israeli success rate through sheer volume?
So if the Hezbollah rockets would be able to challenge the interception rate of Iron Dome, if I understand correctly? Or?
I think Iron Dome, but also probably of Arrow, I think, is the question from Hezbollah.
Well, I mean, in terms of the number, clearly the way it works is that with the sheer number of Hezbollah rockets, this would be definitely a challenge for Iron Dome. Having said that, the system, the way Iron Dome works is that the system only fires an interceptor if the rocket is going to a populated area. What we see, for instance, with Hamas is that if you have a rocket being fired from Gaza that is going to unpopulated area, or sometimes actually to Gaza, the Iron Dome system will not be activated. So clearly, if we have Hezbollah firing, let's say, hundreds of, or let's say just 10,000 of rockets, this will definitely put tremendous pressure on Israel at this stage. Because as I said, we already had 6,000 rockets being fired at Israel. The challenge is the quantity, but also the length of the rocket campaign. What we know from history is that in 2006, and Hezbollah at the time was less sophisticated than now, in 2006, after 30 days of war, Hezbollah was still able to fire rockets at Israel. So it's a matter of quantity, but also how long Iron Dome can sustain the flow of rockets being fired at the country.
Got it. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. I apologize for the questions that we did not get to have a chance to answer today. Let me thank Jean-Loup, Dina, Alex for joining us this afternoon. The complexities associated with this conflict are only going to increase as it goes on, and we look forward to having all of you join us again as we seek to explore all facets of and perspectives related to the war. To find the very latest analysis on the war written by a range of experts, please go to atlanticcouncil.org. Thank you for joining us.